Good morning. Sorry about we're having technical difficulties um, here on this end. My name is Sky Anderson. I'm from Alderville First Nation, and I work at the CCNS building here in Pickering. Today we have our guest speaker, Kory, and he had to call in today to give this presentation. I'm going to be sharing it for him when he is able to get on. We're having a lot of technical difficulties, but a little background of Treaty Week is that since 2016, Ontario has held Treaty Recognition Week, the first week of November, to honor the importance of treaties and raise awareness about treaty rights and relationships. So today's speaker is Gnu Golden Eagle, Kory Snache. He's worked for the past 20 years in the fields of education, social services, and recreation. Kory also incorporates Indigenous knowledge and worldviews into his practice. Kory is a member of the Ojibwe of Rama First Nation of the Anishinaabe people. He currently teaches at Wissahickon First Nation, and he lectures at Brock University and Lakehead University, and provides cultural, land-based recreation for Indigenous communities and organizations. Kory will be talking about the progression of treaties and how it impacts corporate and community relationships. Welcome, Kory.
Thank you for having me. And Ani to everybody, and sorry about the delay. For some reason, my MacBook isn't being friendly to Microsoft Teams. But happy to be here, happy that all you are here. And basically today, what we're going to talk about throughout this presentation is the historical relationship, how treaties first began, how we are where we are in the country today in terms of treaty relationship. So basically all the whys and hows behind that. So how we became partners in peace to neo-colonialism with Indigenous nations and communities, not just within Ontario, but across the country as a whole. So the whole process, of course, covers the whole country. So I just wanted to talk about the bigger scope, and we will talk a bit about Ontario and the treaty process within this province as well. So at any time, if you have a question, feel free to reach out. And again, sorry I can't see all your beautiful faces, but again, grateful to be here. So if we just go to slide 2, Sky, sorry. So what is a treaty? So treaties, we know them worldwide as agreements between nation to nation, and that's the same concept of what it is here in North America. A formally concluded and ratified agreement between countries. Treaties agreement in written form between nation states that intend to establish a relationship. And in this country, the relationships with treaties have always progressed over time throughout the centuries. So what we've seen historically are treaties go from a reliance upon Indigenous people for survival in every structure and every way, shape, and form, to basically Indigenous people becoming second-class citizens in their own country, and dominance of basically colonial powers becoming nation states and utilizing the land for their benefit. So the relationship has really shifted across the land. However, there is still legal fiduciary obligations because of treaties that are still in place to this day. And there's always a lot of questions as to why treaties and the importance have kind of fallen to the wayside, or why Indigenous nations are just challenging treaties in court and land claims and so on and so forth, or treaty annuities in court. And we'll dive into that. So even with Indigenous people, there's 2 examples on the slide of how we see treaties to be in our traditional language. So there's Ojibwe and Cree. In Ojibwe, the word for treaty literally means putting things together. So the concept of working together for a common good. And in Cree, the concept is the Queen's promises. So you really see what power ended up with dominance, and you see the concept of a treaty from an Indigenous perspective. So what you told, basically what you said you're going to give us for in exchange for something, if that makes sense. So the outline basically the rights and responsibilities and relationship between First Nation people, the federal government, and the provincial government as well. So anytime treaties go through the court process, all of that has to be tackled. And it can be a very, very lengthy process, anywhere from 10 to 30 years in court when a treaty is challenged in court. So on slide 3, why treaties? So if we look at the historical relation with treaties, so treaty making, and again, sorry about this slide. I made it on Google Slides and transferred over to PowerPoint. It kind of went a little bit wonky, so I apologize. So treaty making in North America has its roots in the historical relationship that First Nations had with each other. So before the style of European treaties came into place, Indigenous nations had their own form of treaties in the form of wampums and wampum belts. So if you're around the GTA area, and if you work in a corporate entity, a lot of people talk about the dish with one spoon treaty, which we will explore a bit. But what that is, it's a treaty that is a concept of an agreement that covers a certain area, swath of land. And it outlines all the stipulations that fall under that agreement. So that was widely respected even by European nations when they first came to North America. They signed in wampum agreements with Indigenous people, and then it became a European style system with actual written down treaties. So treaty making protocols were adopted by early explorers, and I use the term explorers loosely because you can't explore an area where people already exist, the fur trade and others who entered First Nation lands. So without a treaty, you couldn't travel through another nation's territory, or without a wampum agreement or some form of formalized agreement, you couldn't enter another nation's territory. That could be seen almost as an act of war or as an insult. So they were widely used by a lot of colonial powers, from specific fur traders all the way to government officials, government appointed officials, I should say. So with Indigenous people, protocols included ceremonies which solidified the parties, the spirit and intent of what was happening, gift giving, exchange, and feasting. So that still continues today within communities and nations. And if you ever heard of the term powwow, with the powwow celebration, that actually comes from the word pwagan, which is comes from the concept of our pipe ceremony, pwagan ceremony, and that typically was done to ratify an agreement that was in place. So later, the powwow amalgamated into a whole different concept of what it is today. But originally, the powwow came from the pipe ceremony. So in Ontario and across the land, on slide 4, the most important piece of paper, we call this our Indigenous Terra Nullius, or Magna Carta, I should say, is a Royal Proclamation of 1763. And this is what solidifies treaties within Canada as a legally respected article, if that makes sense. So this has what has enshrined the treaty process into the Constitution, into Canada's Constitution, and it's protected by case law. So this means that any treaty that was signed, even pre-Confederation, has to be respected legally, and everything within that treaty. And that's why we see so many court cases about treaties now today in the country. So it was issued by King George III following the 7 Years' War. So the 7 Years' War is where the French lost power in what is now Canada by being defeated by the British. And it outlined the process of what's going to happen relationship-wise between Indigenous people and the Crown and England. So the Crown and England are separate entities, and that's something that needs to be understood. So the Crown, if you ever heard of the term the Commonwealth, the Crown is kind of like a private bank that the English monarchy used to launch expeditions around the world to colonize. It was funded by the bank, which is the Crown. So that's why that term Commonwealth exists. So the Crown was its own corporate entity, and the English monarchy had to deal with them as well. So any funds taken from Indigenous lands under the treaty process typically gets broken up between the nation state, the Crown, and Indigenous people, if that makes sense. So it set out all these conditions under which First Nation lands can be acquired, how that process will look like and continue to look like. And It established a certain legal order and principles along which the treaty process had to take part, if that makes sense. So on slide 5, so the Royal Proclamation of 1763, the significance of it is listed below. So it recognized that Indigenous people lived on traditional lands. It also recognized that basically Indigenous sovereignty, Indigenous people just weren't wanderless groups wandering the land aimlessly, that they were actually just part of distinct cultures and groups, and they just weren't individuals. The Crown required an agreement with First Nations people to acquire land. So this is even in effect today with any Crown land. So Crown land is also Indigenous land. It's not just sole entity of the Crown. And by law, any Crown land that is to be sold at public sale, you have to consult with the Indigenous title holders of the land as well. So we see a lot of that not being done. And then usually from that, court cases abound from it. So anytime Crown land is sold, they have to consult whoever the treaty holder is for that land by law. So that is even within Ontario as well. So another big factors is First Nations people have title to their land unless they surrendered it. It's very important to understand that not every treaty is a surrender treaty. There are actually very few that are. Majority are not land surrender treaties. Only typically in Ontario do you find land surrender treaties. And it also puts Indigenous people under the protection of the Crown. So this means militarily, economically, that we were partners basically with the Crown, which was a corporate entity. So they have a fiduciary obligation today to basically take care of Indigenous people because of the Royal Proclamation of 1763. So on slide 6, we look at the Treaty of Niagara, the summer of 1764. So this is very significant because it showed the historical respect of Indigenous agreement making with the wampum, but it also was the largest political gathering ever in North America to date. Even to this day, there's never been such a massive meeting politically. So over 2,000 First Nation leaders. So these are representatives of 2,000 different nations. 2,000 leaders from 24 nations went to Niagara Falls, met with the Crown, met with the English, and signed the Treaty of Niagara in 1764. So it's known as a few things. It's known as a peace. It's known as the Great Peace. It's known as the Covenant Chain Wampum as well. But because of the Treaty of Niagara, this also reinforced the earlier agreement with the Royal Proclamation. So it made it even more so enforced that it could not be broken, the bond cannot be broken. This came about because Indigenous nations were warring against European settlement, and there was basically a deadlock and a lot of casualties are happening, and there's no expansion truly happening, and all nations wanted to end basically all the warfare that was going on. So that's why in some ways they call it the Great Peace. So again, it just reinforced Indigenous acknowledgement of land and title, which all treaties are in regards to. So we look at slide 7, the Royal Proclamation Treaty Making Canada. This is somewhat of how the treaty process took place. So if you look at the Royal Proclamation from 1763, and you go all the way to modern day treaties, it tells of the whole process and the change in relationship between the two. So in 1763, you saw a reliance upon Indigenous people as allies and as strong forces economically and militarily. And that was the same with the Treaty of Niagara of 1764. And then you have the pre-Confederation treaties. And what those were basically treaties looking at military alliance, and then they started getting into the area of land grabbing. So when we look at the War of 1812, that was the last time when Canada had to rely on Indigenous people militarily as allies. And if you look at statistics around that war, England was basically trying to cut out a piece of the pie in North America. They're at war with the Americans. They had just defeated the French 7 years war previously, so they're trying to gain dominance. And in that War of 1812, Indigenous people supplied more military force than the English or Americans did on either side. So even the Americans knew that they had to respect Indigenous people militarily because they didn't have the military might to overcome Indigenous people. After the War of 1812, the fur trade had collapsed. The English had taken over, and politically, and in terms of a colonial power, and the United States were confined to their border to the south. The English wanted to settle. So the difference between the English and the French, what the biggest piece was the fact that the French were never truly concerned about settlement. They only wanted the economic wealth from the land, and the British wanted to settle and expand. That's what they were trying to do all over the world, and were doing it successfully. So after the War of 1812, the collapse of the fur trade, the collapse of the French making Indigenous people wealthy, nations wealthy through the fur trade, the English basically saw, because they were a very church and state people, they saw Indigenous people as second class, and they started to form policies to basically keep them in a second class area. So at that time, historically, around basically in the area of 1725 to 1854, if you were a non-white Christian around the world, anywhere where the British ruled, you were seen as basically a heathen or nothing. And they developed policies in all these areas to subject those people to basically a higher class, an elitist class. So after the War of 1812, everything started to change, and then colonial policies against Indigenous people started to become more commonplace within pre-Confederation governments. And then post-Confederation, after Canada was formed, in the area of 1871, 1923, the government formed a whole act, parliamentary act, in the Indian Act to control Indigenous people. And it basically outlined a whole new relationship with Indigenous people of how to move forward within Canada. The biggest thing that Canada recognized at that time is the fact that with these treaties they had in place, they had that fiduciary responsibility to take care of Indigenous people. So they had to, and they wanted to, eliminate Indigenous people as a legal entity. So with the Indian Act, that was one way in which, if they could eliminate a Native person as being a status Indian, then they wouldn't be considered a treaty Indian anymore, and they wouldn't have any benefit or any ties to whatever treaty that individual was tied to, if their nation had signed treaties. So that's a huge understanding. One of the main things behind residential school and behind all these Canadian assimilation policies was the fact that it wasn't just, there's no inherent way people just inherently hate each other. They were trying to erase a number of things, and one of those pieces again was eliminating Indigenous people as a beneficiary to a treaty, so they didn't have to take care of them or recognize them anymore in their rights. If that makes sense. So that's one of the big part of that picture. So with all these policies, there's a number of different things in place. And in 1923, one of the first treaties with Canada is signed, but also one of the last treaties with Canada is signed. So in 1923, the Williams Treaty is signed, which I'm sure a lot of you have learned about already. And that encompasses a large swath of Ontario, of what is now Ontario. It's one of the largest treaties areas in the country. And what it did, effectively, it was called a blanket clause treaty, where basically it wasn't specific as to what was surrendered and it was worded in such a way that it could be interpreted a number of different ways when challenged in court. So that was the last treaty that was signed in 1923, typically with the Canadian government, except for the very few modern treaties today. And then today we have the modern treaty process. So that started in 1975 and went to present. And what that is the modern day treaties, what they target is the era of taxation. And what the government typically pushes for within those treaties is the ability to tax Indigenous lands, but for joint benefit of both nations. So both for Canada and the First Nation. The benefit to Canada is that it alleviates some of the costs that comes from the federal government for First Nations, even though that money comes from a trust fund set aside for First Nations that derives from Crown lands. So the money, it's not like the money isn't there. The money is already there. But it forced it, in a way, the community or nation has to agree to tax their own people for the benefit of their own communities. So that's kind of what a modern day treaty encompasses, if that makes sense. So there's not many of those in the country. So if you look at slide 8, this basically defines the whole treaty process across the country. So if you look on the East Coast around Newfoundland and New Brunswick and Nova Scotia area, you basically see the peace and friendship treaties. So those began in 1725 and 1779. So around that area, historically, and if you're kind of a history buff, you'll kind of love this stuff, but on the East Coast, what was happening was Indigenous nations were meeting European nations at the time, and there was a lot of different European nations that were involved on the East Coast. From the Spanish, there was the Dutch to the south, there was the French and the English. And what was happening is all those European nations were recruiting Indigenous people to support them in their wars all around that territory. So the peace and friendship treaties basically outlined military alliances and trade alliances. There was no land surrenders in those treaties whatsoever. So today, that's why in court, and we see it on the news, we see especially the Mi'kmaq and Wolastoq people, they're fighting to create their own industries within industries. So the biggest example of that is the lobster fishing industry. The government is trying to squash that concept of them forming their own livelihood outside of the constraints of the government. However, legally, the Indigenous people, because of the Royal Proclamation, are allowed to do that. And they actually, by law, have full control of their lands because there's been no specific land surrender. So they legally are entitled to do what they're doing. So that's the contention around it all. So you saw the peace and friendship treaties begin. So you see the reliance of European nations upon Indigenous people. And then when you see the Upper Canada land surrenders from 1764 to 1862, you get into that switch of hands of power. So the French lose their control, the Americans are defeated, and the English gain control. And in the purple and red areas, they start to settle. Thus, they know that they need to sign a treaty in order to have the land. So that all begins. So that's why, because of the Royal Proclamation, they have to sign a treaty in order to settle, in order to have all rights entitled to the land. So that begins. But every specific treaty has a whole outline of specifically there's no two treaties that are the same. Each one has their own stipulations. So that takes control in Ontario. So in the yellow area, we see the Robson-Huron Treaty, and that treaty is actually currently in court right now, and it's in its final phase of negotiation. And currently, the provincial government just infringed on it, and they're trying to stop it. So it was almost done, and then the provincial government stepped in, and they're challenging a part of it. So now there's going to be another bunch of years in court. So that treaty alone is based on annuities. So that one is basically in the treaty. What it says is half of all revenue from lands within this treaty area go to the Indigenous nations that signed on to this treaty. So on that treaty, there's 17 Indigenous nations. They're entitled to 50% of all revenue that's generated from that land. and that's what's in court. So the government is terrified of it because that's not a small chunk of change. The Supreme Court has ordered Canada to honorably settle this matter, and the Indigenous nations want their 50%. They're not taking a paycheck. So that's going to be within the trillions of dollars. And it's not, when you think about that area, it's logging, it's mining, it's a big area where natural resources come from. So then in the green area, we enter the numbered treaties from 1871 and 1921. So historically, what's happening across the country at this time, the American Civil War had ended. The English had just formed Canada had formed a new country, a new nation state, and told England to beat it. They became their own country. After 4 years, Canada was actually broke as a country. They had no money left in their coffers. So they knew they needed to produce a GDP, and they needed to expand and settle. So they needed large swaths of land. So if you look at slide 8 and at the green area, all the numbered treaties begin. So they're afraid of a few things. The Russians have control in Alaska. The Russians actually had trade agreements with the West Coast nations through whatever their agreement process is for the West Coast nations. So here we use wampum. They had a different ceremony and a different protocol that was similar on the West Coast. And also they were afraid of the Spaniards to the south that were settling around California. And the Americans, because the Civil War had ended, had millions of soldiers all of a sudden, whereas Canada had nothing. They literally had a couple of military units and militia. So they started to rush and expand across from the East Coast to the West Coast. So you had the railroad being implemented. You had Indigenous people being pushed out of the way by purposeful killing of the buffalo, taking away their sustenance to put them on reservations. And you also had, so I'm trying to think, you also had the creation of the RCMP, which was also to enforce basically the Indian Act and other government policies for expansion. So they were actually made to police the West. And the West at that time was Indigenous people. There were typically no Europeans out there unless you were a trader. So even for Vancouver Island in 1885 was still 90% Indigenous people. So that's, when you think about the grand scheme of time, that's actually not too long ago. So that's the numbered treaties. And then we have the Douglas treaties, which you can barely see, but it's on Vancouver Island. There's 2 points on Vancouver Island. So if you've ever been to Victoria, you can actually go to where the fort was, and you can actually see where Fort Victoria was. That's Douglas Treaty land there. And basically up by Port Hardy, if you've ever been up that way on northern Vancouver Island, there's a little spot there that's part of the Douglas Treaty. So those were strategic military trade places that Europeans and Indigenous people utilized. So the English wanted it so they could protect their borders essentially. So they rushed all around the numbered treaties, signed those, and then rushed all the way back. But even those are very contentious, those treaties as well, because of the wording in them. So when you look at this map, all the white area has never been surrendered on paper. Even for the numbered treaties, that land has never been surrendered. So legally, under the Constitution, Canada has no rights under those lands. The Indigenous nations do. So that's what's all in court right now, and that's why you see Indigenous people demonstrating against corporate growth, and they demonstrate against expansionism within their territories, because it's typically the corporate entities that profit off those lands, not the Indigenous people. So now we see things like joint benefit agreements happening, which is a good thing. But also a lot of Indigenous nations are just looking for those honorable joint agreements, if that makes sense, where everyone comes to the table in good faith and works together. But in certain areas of the land, we're not seeing that. So on the East Coast, again, we're not seeing that with the fisheries, and on the West Coast, we're not seeing that with oil and gas pipelines. So there's a lot that goes into that, though. So there's a lot that go into it. Recognition of Indigenous lands rights by corporate entities, not just corporate entities, but also government entities, and even down to the individuals. But basically, it can all be done in good faith if it wants to be. So on page 9, we're looking at, slide 9, we're looking at treaties within Ontario. So this also kind of outlines the historical treaty process. So we have the Crawford Purchase on the right side of the map. So if you look at 1783, that was to protect Kingston, because Kingston was a major naval base. And then you also had another unique one is the Treaty 4 of 1793, where Brantford and Six Nations of Grand River is located. So if you see that strip of land, that's been in the news with the Haldimand Tract Treaty. That tract of land, the reason why it's not straight and perpendicular and basically running on latitude and longitude lines is because that land follows historical trade and military route and economic route of the Grand River. So that was promised to the Six Nations people for allying with the English during the War of 1812. And that was the first time our people, the Anishinaabe people and the Haudenosaunee allied together and not fought against each other. We allied with each other to fight against the Americans. So the English promised that land to Six Nations if they allied with them during the war and if they're victorious, which they were. So that whole tract of land technically by law belongs to the people of the Six Nations. So that's why we've seen in Caledonia demonstrations happening against development. Technically, those developments are happening on Haudenosaunee lands, not Canadian lands. Under treaty, that is the law. So that's where conflict arises. And then you see land grab treaties happening. So when we see all the nice blocks of land that are going by latitude, longitude lines, those are the land surrender treaties. So that is for English settlement. So they're rushing, and then you see the Johns Collins Purchase of 1785. That again was for a trade and military route. Anything previously 1800 was done for military and trade purposes. Everything after that was for land grabbing and settlement and expansion. So on slide 10 just shows another map of Ontario and the treaties that cover Ontario. So you have some of the numbered treaties, and then you get into the Robinson-Huron, the Women's Treaties, and the Upper Canada Land Surrenders. That's a bigger hook. So again, each treaty has their specific stipulations. So if you are a corporate entity that operates within these territories, because you operate within the country of Canada, you have to go by also what stipulations are on the treaty that govern the land, because it is a nation-to-nation agreement. So however you identify, whatever you think, we're a corporation, we're this or this or this, you should also, with corporate practice, you should be looking at, we're in this treaty territory, what are the stipulations of this treaty? Because every person in this country are duty bound by treaties. It is a legal obligation, even down to an individual. So we are all, like there's that phrase, we're all treaty people, and that is very much a true fact. So for corporation, the bigger picture and the bigger idea is how do you compute that into your practices, right? Because that is the difficulty, that is the struggle. Because even though it's a nation-to-nation agreement, the government is supposed to monitor everybody they insure that works and employs within their country. Like that's why we have SIN numbers. SIN numbers are social insurance numbers. That insures us to work for the state. So that's the bigger picture that's everybody's struggling with, even the courts, even corporations. And we see that conflict all across the country. So on slide 11, so who benefits from treaties? So treaties benefit all Canadians, but the treaties also have responsibilities and obligations for Canadian First Nations. What do treaties mean today? So they're the fundamental building blocks of this country. So it allowed for expansion. It allowed for government policies to be created. It allowed for survival and economic success of this country. So on slide 12, so what is the treaty relationship? So treaties establish a historical treaty relationship between First Nations, the Crown, and I'd also like to add in the Crown isn't necessarily Canada. Again, the Crown is basically like a private bank. It's separate from Canada. So when you think about some treaties are based upon a 60-40 split. So that means 40% of the wealth goes to Indigenous people, 30% goes to the Crown, and 30% goes to Canada. They're all a partner in that agreement, and that's how Crown land operates. So all the money that goes to Indigenous people even today comes through the federal government, but it's money generated from Crown land. It's not people's taxpayers' dollars as perceived, and that's because of the Royal Proclamation. So treaties very, very much do matter. So on slide 13, so why is it important to Canadian history? Again, outlines the foundation for historical treaty relationship and the relationship between Indigenous people and Canada. It's a foundation of the building blocks, and it has allowed Canada to exist. And it allowed for peaceful access for across the country, essentially. And the treaty benefits that benefit all people, Indigenous people, Canadians, and the Crown. So even monies generated from Indigenous lands still go to pay for infrastructure of the country and everything and so on and so forth. So treaties are very much a benefit. So that should become common knowledge for all Canadian citizens, or even within education, within every corporate structure, even corporate law, it should be learned about, all of it, which I know that it's just starting to be. But even within case law, if you become a corporate lawyer, you kind of touch on the understanding of it. If you become a lawyer that learns about treaties and land claims, like an Indigenous issues focused lawyer, you learn more so about that. The problem is a lot of communities only hire corporate lawyers. So they might not have an in-depth understanding of what treaties actually are and how it actually works and what are the case laws behind it. Because when you become a lawyer and you start looking at whether it's corporate or a treaty or whatever, when you pick your stream, you only learn about case laws surrounding about what you specifically became a lawyer for. So an environmental lawyer, for instance, couldn't work for a First Nation and understand about treaty process, because they would never have learned about that in law school. They would have learned about environmental law. So it's important that even for corporations, if they're hiring, if they're wanting to expand, or if they're hiring certain people, that they understand, okay, if you're a corporate lawyer, but we also need to know what obligations we have legally under the treaty process. And that's I think a huge loss for a lot of organizations, that they don't have that scope, I guess, is a big thing. But sorry about the loss of time. I was hoping to do a longer presentation and a more bulkier one, but thank you for hanging in here if you did. And I don't want to run past too much time, but does anyone have any questions or anything of the sort?
Hey, Kory. So we've actually disabled the question and answer for this presentation,
Okay, cool.
and it was just strictly a learning environment. So
oh, no problem. Okay, cool.
we really appreciate you coming here and bearing with us through all the technical difficulties.
No problem.
But very, very valuable information that was shared today, and we do really appreciate you sharing your knowledge with us. For sure. And yeah, if there are any questions, people can direct them to me, skyanderson@opg.com. And then I'll find my way to Kory. We'll connect, and hopefully I'll circle back
Awesome.
to you. But no, miigwech, it was very, very valuable. And I'll touch base with you soon here, Kory.
Awesome.
Take care.
Yeah, sorry about that, everybody, and thank you. Thanks for having me.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye. Take care.